I think you'll find our time in Genesis 19, our passage today, strategically relevant and very profitable. The 38 verses of Genesis 19, they're infamous because of the utter and almost unimaginable destruction visited by God on the city of Sodom. And it wasn't just Sodom. Along with it, several other cities, settlements, and agriculture for hundreds of miles around, they were all simultaneously wiped out. Today, 14 kilometers from the Dead Sea lies Tal Haman, the largest archaeological dig site in the Jordan Valley. And there, archaeologists are slowly piecing together what happened. They tell us this happened suddenly, that it wasted everything around, making the area uninhabitable for 600 to 700 years. Now, think of the utter devastation. Nagasaki and Hiroshima that were nuked by the Americans to end World War II, well, they were back and running in just 5 years or so. But Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, Bela, everything around, they were rendered uninhabitable for 600 to 700 years. In fact, to this day, the surrounding areas are only able to feed and support token populations. That is what we're looking at here. We first encountered Sodom, you will recall, in Genesis 14. The account of the epic battle at the tar pits in the valley of Siddim, in the vicinity of Sodom. Genesis 14, verse 10. Now that word Sodom has since come to be widely used as a metaphor for homosexuals and homosexuality. The word sodomy is used in a legal context to describe sexual crimes against nature, including anal or oral sex or even bestiality. The word sodomite is as strong a pejorative as you can get for practicing homosexuals. Now, some insist that Genesis 19's inescapable focus on the city of Sodom, that it wasn't meant to put a spotlight on homosexuality. Now, that it wasn't really meant to shine a searing light on homosexuality, a contemptible plague on humanity unlike any other. But the very etymology of the word Sodom, sodomite, sodomy, alone makes short work of that. It's a misdirection that is shamelessly foisted on the naive and the biblically illiterate. Read Genesis 18 and 19. It's as plain as day. God considers homosexuality a particularly heinous and reprehensible sin. Homosexuality is the overarching backdrop of both chapters. An awfully grievous and heinous sin in God's eyes that inevitably leads to divine judgment. In Genesis 18, God came to Abram along with 2 angels, and as Abram was sending them off, God himself said this: "The outcry," he said, "of Sodom and Gomorrah is indeed great. Their sin is exceedingly grave." Genesis 18, verse 20. Now there are multiple narrative threads in Genesis 19, but they all combine into an accurate, spot-on portrait of Lot, Abraham's nephew. That portrait shows us God thoroughly knew Lot, exactly what he was like. It's a precious, precious section of Scripture that uncomfortably asks all of us to look inside into all of our hearts. This morning is all about Lot from the inside out, a portrait masterfully painted by God himself. Let me offer you a simple outline up front, just so we stay together as we dig into this portrait as it unfolds in the long narrative. From Genesis 19, from 1 to 9, righteous Lot, seriously. From Genesis 19, 10 to 26, testing reveals the rot inside. And from 27 to 38, the concluding part of the chapter, all lost but saved as through fire. Let's all stand together and read Genesis 19. Brace yourself, we're probably going to take another 10 minutes just to read this. Verse 1, let's read it together. Now the two angels came to Sodom in the evening as Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them and bowed down with his face to the ground. And he said, Now behold, my lords, please turn aside into your servant's house and spend the night and wash your feet. Then you may rise early and go on your way. They said, however, No, but we shall spend the night in the square. Yet he urged them, verse 3, he urged them strongly that they turned aside to him and entered his house, and he prepared a feast for them and baked unleavened bread, and they ate. Before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, surrounded the house, both young and old, all the people from every quarter, and they called to Lot and said to him, Where are the men that came to you tonight? Bring them out to us, that we may have relations with them. But Lot went out to them at the doorway and shut the door behind him and said, Please, my brothers, do not act wickedly. Now behold, I have two daughters who have not had relations with men. Please, let me bring them out to you and do to them whatever you like. Only do nothing to these men, inasmuch as they have come under the shelter of my roof. Verse 9. But they said, Stand aside. Furthermore, they said, This one came in as an alien, and already he's acting like a judge. Now we will treat you worse than them. And so they pressed hard against Lot and came near to break the door. Verse 10. But the men reached out their hands and brought Lot into the house with them and shut the door. They struck the men who were at the doorway of the house with blindness, both small and great, so that they wearied themselves trying to find the doorway. Then the two men said to Lot, Whom else do you have there? A son-in-law, and your sons, and your daughters, and whomever you have in the city, bring them out of the place, for we are about to destroy this place, because their outcry has become so great before the Lord, that the Lord sent us to destroy it. Verse 14. Lot went out and spoke to his sons-in-law, who were to marry his daughters, and said, Up, get out of this place, for the Lord will destroy the city. But he appeared to his sons-in-law to be jesting. When morning dawned, the angels urged Lot, saying, Up, take your wife and your two daughters who are here, or you will be swept away in the punishment of the city. But he hesitated. So the man seized his hand, and the hand of his wife, and the hands of his two daughters, for the compassion of the Lord was upon him. And they brought him out and put him outside the city. When they had brought him outside, one said, Escape for your life. Do not look behind you, and do not stay anywhere in the valley. Escape to the mountains, or you will be swept away. Verse 18, But Lot said to them, Oh no, my lords, now behold, your servant has found favor in your sight, and you have magnified your loving kindness, which you have shown me by saving my life. But I cannot escape to the mountains, for the disaster will overtake me, and I will die. Now behold, this town is near enough to flee to. It is small. Please, let me escape there. Is it not small, that my life may be saved? He said to him, Behold, I grant you this request also, not to overthrow the town of which you have spoken. Hurry, escape there, for I cannot do anything until you arrive there. Therefore, the name of the town was called Zoar. Verse 23, The sun had risen over the earth when Lot came to Zoar. And then the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah brimstone and fire from the Lord out of heaven. And he overthrew those cities, and all the valley, and all the inhabitants of the cities, and what grew on the ground. But his wife from behind him looked back, and she became a pillar of salt. Verse 27, Now Abram rose early in the morning, went to the place where he had stood before the Lord, and he looked down towards Sodom and Gomorrah, and up toward the land of the valley, and he saw, and behold, the smoke of the land ascended like the smoke of a furnace. Thus it came about, when God destroyed the cities of the valley, that God remembered Abraham and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow, when he overthrew the cities in which Lot lived. Lot went up from Zoar, stayed in the mountains, and his two daughters with him, for he was afraid to stay in Zoar, and stayed in a cave, he and his two daughters. Then the firstborn, verse 31, said to the younger, Our father is old. There is not a man on earth to come to us after the manner of the earth. Come, let us make our father drink wine. Let us lie with him, that we may preserve our family through our father. And so they made their father drink wine that night. And the firstborn went in and lay with her father. And he did not know when she lay down and when she arose. The following morning, the firstborn said to the younger, Behold, I lay last night with my father. Let us make him drink wine tonight. Then you go in and lie with him, that we may preserve our family through our father. And so they made their father drink wine that night also. And the younger arose and lay with him. And he did not know when she lay down and when she arose. Thus, both the daughters of Lot were with child by their father. The firstborn bore a son and called his name Moab. He is the father of the Moabites to this day. As for the younger, she also bore a son and called his name Ben-Ami. He is the father of the sons of Ammon to this day. Please be seated. What were you all thinking as we read that opening section of the text? I read verses 1 to 5 repeatedly as I prepared, and honestly, I found that opening section thoroughly revolting. Verse 4, before they could lie down to sleep, all of the men, both young and old, from every part of the city of Sodom surrounded the house. They shouted to Lot, Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us so that we can have sex with them. We read that earlier in the NASB, but I put that in the Net Bible there because all of the details are more vividly spelled out. The NASB's rendition, bring them out that we may have relations with them, is remarkably bland and tepid. Too much is lost in the translation. Obviously, violent homosexual sex was what they had in mind. Lot's shocking reply in verse 8 very, very clearly confirms that. The monstrous, over-the-top depravity of that violent mob, salivating, lasting to sodomize Lot's guests, vividly jumps off the page. God made it a point to wordsmith this very precisely. They made to forcibly sodomize, to homosexually gang rape the two men. And you get the sense that these violent sexual depredations, they occurred rather routinely in Sodom. To put that all in context, we consider the following. Homosexuality, even bestiality, were among the many perversions and aberrations of the Canaanites. It was part of the monstrous rubrics of life in those places. And that's why it's specifically addressed in Leviticus. Leviticus 18, verses 22 to 24. You shall not lie with a male as one lies with a female. It is an abomination. You shall not have intercourse with any animal to be defiled with it. Nor shall any woman stand before an animal to mate with it. It is a perversion, it says. Do not defile yourself by any of these things, for by all of this, these nations I am casting out before you have been defiled. Then, Leviticus 20. If there's a man who lies with a male as those who lie with a woman, both of them have committed a detestable act, and they shall surely be put to death. Their blood guiltiness is upon them. Moreover, you shall not follow the customs of the nation which I will drive out before you, for they did all of these things, and therefore I abhor them. It's impossible to miss how God looks at homosexuality. The words are crystal clear. I have abhorred them, he says. What a shameless travesty to try and spin all of that to say homosexuality wasn't really that big of a thing. But I suppose the LGBT proponents have to try and do that. Otherwise, they will not be able to live with themselves. Now, either that or totally disavow and label all of this as ancient myths and legends, despite all of the undeniable and irrefutable evidence all around. Let's begin to put together the striking portrait of Lot that we have here. God has gone to great lengths to paint it for us in Genesis. It's actually a comprehensive and very revealing portrait. In Genesis 12, verse 4 and following, we're told Lot was Abraham's nephew, the son of his brother Haran. He did not receive the call of God to leave Ur, to go to a new land, just like Abraham did. But apparently he was caught up in Abraham's vision and went along on the journey. He too trekked 800 miles to Canaan. He trekked that with Abraham. He was with Abraham many years, and during those years he prospered in many material ways, and presumably spiritually as well. But now, with the passing of time, we find him subtly wiggling away from God's grasp and got on a very, very slippery slope. Given first choice of the land by Abraham, he succumbs to the glitzy life of the Jordan Valley, leaving the obviously more difficult highlands to Abraham. Now, all of that feeds into a character sketch in verses 7 and 8 on Genesis 19. Behold, my brothers, do not act wickedly. Now, behold, I have 2 daughters who have not had relations with men. Please, let me bring them out to you and do with them whatever you like. Only do nothing to these men. Now, take note that Lot's response to the mob was admirable. One might even almost say gallant. Lot went out to them in the doorway, shutting the door behind him, and stood between his guests and that wild mob. That plea, I beg you, my brothers, do not act so wickedly, was actually a moral judgment, gently expressed. And the rebuke wasn't lost on that mob, and hence the very angry response in verse 9. However, Lot's touch of gallantry was immediately eclipsed by that horrid proposal that follows. Behold, I have 2 daughters. They've not had relations with men. Please bring them out to let me bring them out to you. Do with them whatever you like, he said. Lot's conflicted mind had pushed him to an intolerable compromise. And unbelievably, he places hospitality for his guests above the sanctity of his family. Obviously, a monstrously horrible breach of fatherly duty. His 2 daughters, you see, were betrothed as virgins. Under Mesopotamian law, betrothal was as sacrosanct as consummated marriage. His offer effectively placed his daughters in mortal jeopardy. It would have been a violation that called for the death penalty. Had Lot's offer been taken up, his daughters would have been executed, and that after the travesty of having been gang raped by that mob. I gotta tell you, my emotional response to all that was, what a pathetic excuse for a father. What a disgusting little man. Had the Apostle Paul not explicitly said so, I never would have taken Lot to be a bona fide believer. And yet that's what Peter says. 2 Peter chapter 2 says, if he rescued righteous Lot, oppressed by the sensual conduct of unprincipled men, by what he saw and heard, that righteous man, while living among them, felt his righteous soul tormented day after day. In case you missed it, there, Peter called righteous 3 times. 3 times. I guess he wanted to make sure that we all didn't miss that. Don't miss that also, Peter describes Lot as distressed. In Hebrew, literally worn down by all of the filth around him. He also says he was tormented. That came from bazanizo. I looked it up. It means vexed, pained in his soul, as in someone at sea who is furiously struggling against a headwind. Let me ask you, are we tortured by sin around us like this? I asked before, because honestly, many Christians today don't seem to be too concerned with the godlessness and sin that's building up all around us. They seem almost resigned, even apathetic. They don't seem like anything like distressed or tormented, even when they bump up against the over-the-top godlessness and sin. Most today put up or are even amused by the antics of the ever-present obligatory gays on TV shows. Some are no longer disturbed or revolted when watching men kissing men lips to lips in films or in TV shows. We all were when we first came upon Brokeback Mountain, that was years ago. But now we watch things on TV like the 2nd season of Designated Survivor. And it's worse. It's actually far worse now. Maybe it comes from watching garbage from Hollywood. It's really nothing more than marginally sanitized porn now. 50 Shades of Grey, and many other titles which I will not repeat here because you may use the links. Many of us take the rampant immorality in TV series like Suits and House of Cards in stride. Maybe all of this comes from being pathologically caught up in all of this. I look closely at the profile given us by God here of Lot in Genesis 19, and frankly, I am appalled by what I see. Clearly, Sodom had gotten inside the man. The composite portrait given us is one of a conflicted soul, at the same time offended and allured by Sodom. He liked the comforts, the culture, the stuff, the prestige, but he was worn down, tortured by the filthy lawlessness around him. We're not told directly, but his wife was probably a pagan sodomite. And neither did it seem to bother him that his daughters were going to marry pagan sodomites, who were probably among the men who were bent on gang raping his guests. Now, bear in mind that after he had been rescued from all of this comes after he had been rescued. Lot was rescued together with everything that he had and rescued and averted lifetime slavery, certain in Genesis 14. He evidently learned nothing from all of that. Why, he's right back and settled in Sodom when next we see him here in Genesis 19. Genesis 14 and now Genesis 19. He's right back. He's in there. But you know what? The more I thought about this, the picture being painted became clearer and clearer. This is exactly what God wanted us to see from this. Exactly what he intended. God wanted us to see in Lot a clear illustration. An illustration of a worldly, half-hearted believer. Lot is a prototype. He's a portrait of many, many believers today. He's not a caricature. He's not a joke. He's not a tragic anti-hero come from mythology or ancient literature. No, he's for real. He's the prototype. The very picture of so many believers today. Believers who know of God and want fellowship with him. Believers who really do want all of that, but they want the world also. Lot's the foolish believer of 1 Corinthians 3. Read that. Each man's work will become evident. The day will show itself because it is to be revealed with fire, and the fire itself will test the quality of each man's work. If any man's work, which he has built on it, remains, he will receive a reward. If any man's work is burned up, he will suffer loss. But take note of this last sentence. But he himself will be saved, yet as through fire. Saved, yes, as through fire. You'll get to heaven on your knees, burned all over. That's possible. Maybe. In 1 Corinthians 3:15 describes Lot to a T. His life was one long downhill slide. The first slippery step came when he looked towards Sodom. We are told that in Genesis 13 verse 10. It was no casual glance. He looked with longing, is the wording. Sodom beckoned with its exciting, glitzy life. And he was near the best land. And Lot, he wanted the best land for himself. The first step, he looked towards Sodom. Next, we're told, he pitched his tents near Sodom. Genesis 13, verse 12. If we had asked him then why near and not inside Sodom, he probably would have said, there's much wickedness in Sodom, in the city, and I want to stay above that. He didn't want to become wicked. But next we see him, he's living in Sodom. That's Genesis 14, verse 12. No explanation for the change, and it's ominous. It's like a moth attracted to the flame. He had been unable to hold his distance. See, Sodom was a super wicked city. By moving in there, he had clearly decided to cross a line. He was akin to a Christian moving into a whorehouse, or running a casino, or getting into a business, running it, even though it was owned and managed by an organized crime syndicate. Well, finally, we find that Lot had become even prominent in Sodom, one of the influencers. That's Genesis 19, verse 1. That's what sitting in the gate implies. Lot's attempt at appeasing the mob had not gone anywhere. But here's the astonishing thing. You read that, and you see that even blindness couldn't cool their lust. Try and frame the scene in your mind's eye. Blind, lust-crazed men, stumbling, groping in darkness. And then the angels ask, have you anyone else here? Son-in-law, sons, daughters? Bring them out. We are about to destroy this. Oh, what does Lot say? What does it say? He goes out to that mountain to seek his two sons-in-law. And notice, they were right there outside. They were a part of that mob. First-class people, those two were. Now, verses 16 and 17. This part is blocked and paced like an epic Hollywood blockbuster. They're painted, backlit by dawn just coming up. That special time of day when the blackness of night begins to lighten before the sun rises. The final dark night of the wicked city of Sodom and all of the others in those condemned places in the Jordan Valley, they had just come to an end. Two angels are silhouetted, running, backdropped by that spreading light, each grasping the hands of two people, speeding through the dark streets, running through the gates, and out toward the rising dawn. In 2018, archaeologists reported on what they'd been finding at Tel Haman. The dig site is right in the Jordan Valley referenced by Genesis 19. Remains of mud-bricked walls and pottery recovered show clear evidence of intense heat. The outer layers of those pots and other clay objects were found partially melted, forming a glassy coat. They found zircon crystals in those glassy coats. Zircon is a mineral that forms under extremely high temperatures and pressure. Put together, the Tel Haman excavations piece together a fascinating story of settlements and cities inhabited at least 2,500 years, up until 1800 and 2000 BC, when all were suddenly abandoned. It was all uninhabitable for 600 to 700 years. And they've been forever trying to find natural explanations for all of that. But evidently, fire and brimstone dramatically altered both the ecology and the geology of the area forever. It was a verdant, well-watered valley, remember? And when Lot was making a decision, and today it's barely able to support the few settlers who farm in that area. Look at the Dead Sea. It's over 1,000 feet deep. It's 10 times saltier than all of the oceans. The super salinity of the place and the land all around, they combine to make a very, very harsh environment in which few plants, fish, and animals exist, let alone flourish. The favored natural explanation? A series of earthquakes that released gases that ignited sulfur and petroleum in the ground, resulting in a firestorm. That's the natural explanation. But God tells us very, very differently, doesn't he? Genesis 19, 24 to 25. And again, it's clearest in the Net Bible. Then the Lord rained down sulfur and fire on Sodom and Gomorrah. It was sent down from the sky by the Lord, and he overthrew those cities and all that region, including all of the inhabitants of the cities and the vegetation that grew on the ground. This sulfur and fire was sent down from the sky. A firestorm that was entirely at God's directive. In fact, it says that twice. The Lord himself did it. Then the Lord rained sulfur and fire on Sodom and Gomorrah. And then secondly, it was sent down from the sky. The judgment had its origin in God. It was decided by God. It was executed by God. Molten rain, fire, and sulfur fell upon the land, incinerating all of the plant and animal life, making all of this a scorched graveyard. Now there are two remarkable sub-narratives in Genesis 19. Everybody probably knows the one about Lot's wife. It says in verse 26, but his wife from behind him looked back and she became a pillar of salt. Now for many, that's the main memory peg for all of this. Looking closely, that backward look had to be more than a momentary look or gaze. We're told in verse 22 that the destruction of Sodom did not begin until Lot and his daughters were safely in Zoar. And that's a very good distance away. So evidently, she balked at going any further and lingered far behind. Now, why would she do that? Was it because of family that she was leaving behind? Or possibly places and thingies that she had gotten used to in Sodom? Well, Jesus clues us in where he warns us to be prepared when the Son of Man comes. We read from there earlier. This is what it says, "On that day, let the one who's in the housetop with his goods in the house not come back to take them away. And likewise, let the one who's in the field not turn back." Apparently, all of that happened because of the wife's reluctance to let go of her household stuff. Remember Lot's wife, it says in Luke 17. She was a wife after Lot's own heart. She was, we are told. Now, the second sub-narrative is not as widely known. Genesis 19 from 19 to 22. Now, this takes the cake. Lot is wheedling with God even as they were fleeing. For many, that's probably just an obscure factoid, but in effect, it's saying that Lot is saying God is not able to preserve his life in a flight to the mountains. And unbelievably, he had the gall to ask God to send him to Zoar, probably a mini Sodom itself. As I was reading that, I was thinking, why not just end this guy's agony? Just take him home. But no. God astonishes yet again. He grants Lot's request. And, my friends, there's more to this than meets the eye. This sub-narrative is so strategically important to us. First of all, it closes the loop on that seemingly unfinished negotiation between God and Abraham at the tail end of Genesis 18. Remember how that ended? God walked away because there weren't any righteous men in Sodom. But there was one, wasn't there? The one that the angel had to grab by the hand to flee. There wasn't any righteous man in Sodom because God had yanked him out of there before he did this. Now the second is an even bigger astonishment, and one that goes back to why we are here in Genesis, looking closely at all of this now. Think of the precision with which God did all of this. He sent fire and sulfur from the sky that wiped everything out, the whole valley of Siddim, the verdant, well-watered plains that attracted Lot to choose this place. Even the salt sea was so wasted that after this it came to be known as the Dead Sea. How do we know that? Well, Genesis 14 verse 3 tells us. It says the valley of Siddim, parenthetically, the Salt Sea. It says the Salt Sea is the ancient name of the Dead Sea. God wiped that out and yet preserved a small dot of a place so small it was called Zoar. Literally, super small. That's what that name means. Now, how did God do that? With all that we know today, it remains impossible to precision bomb something like this. You cannot wipe out hundreds of miles all around while preserving a small dot, part of the target area, in the middle of it, all at the same time. You just cannot do it. How did God do that? Well, He made it all. He can unmake it all any which way He wants. That's how. And that's why we're here in Genesis, isn't it? As I was researching this, I came upon a really interesting website. It said biblical scholars, led by one Michael Saunders, well, they were bent on finding the current location of Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, and Bela. Well, the text in Genesis 14 tells us Bela is just another name for Zoar. And the website says they've found Zoar. It says archaeologists trying to locate the 5 cities pinpointed there in Genesis 14. They found 5 promising sites: Bab Edera, Nomera, Safi, Phaphah, and Kanazer, he said. All five, they were on land. They were connected by wadis or streams to the Dead Sea. But it was Safi, that name that got them all excited, because there's a map that was found on the floor of a 6th century Byzantine church that clearly identifies Safi as Zoar. What does that tell us? It tells us Zoar, that super small dot of a place, it alone survived the wipeout by fire and sulfur from the sky. It survived because God granted Lot's terribly faithless request to flee there and not to the mountains. How do we know Zoar alone survived? Because enhanced satellite photographs show at least 3 geological anomalies under 1,200 feet of water at the bottom of the Dead Sea. They're in an area adjacent to the delta where those 5 are located. And all that suggests, those 5 sites are located, all that suggests that these are the most probable ruins of all the other cities enumerated in Genesis 14. Now that is supported by other relevant data. Data like asphalt-laced rocks, tar bubbles that keep coming up to the surface of the Dead Sea, probably from the same geological structures, the tar pits of Siddim, now underwater. That's why settlers used to call the Dead Sea the Sea of Asphalt. That's why ancient Roman texts actually referred to the Dead Sea as Palus Asphaltitis, the asphalt lake. Do you know that they've already mounted diving expeditions using a small submarine? And they've found artifacts and structural materials like marble ruins, stones with 90-degree corners. All of them are, of course, very heavily encrusted with thick salt deposits. That's the Dead Sea. The implications are as exciting as they are astounding. Imagine singling out, shielding and preserving Zoar, while simultaneously wiping out the Siddim Valley, the Central Plains that were the breadbasket of this whole place, and then sending the remains of Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Seboim to a 1,200 feet watery grave. Wow. But you know what, my friends? As exciting as all of that is, I need you to refocus with me. Refocus on what the Lord wants and intends from all of this for all of us. See, anyone can choose to sin. Growing numbers of seculars, atheists, do that now without much thought, every day. And so can we. So many who call themselves Christians do the same every day. Every day, scores of well-meaning Christians are like Lot, trying to function like him. They do not want to repudiate Christ. They vigorously profess him, but they are not all for Christ either. They have the jobs to think about. They have their friends to think about. They have having a good time to think about, getting ahead. And every day they're jumping in and out of 2 worlds. I've been there. I've done that. And strangely enough, God doesn't stop you when you do that. Of course, there are limits to what He will permit, but nevertheless, He will let you sin. But be advised, you will bear the brunt of the consequences. You will reap those consequences in spades. Lot was preoccupied with worldly things. He rose to welcome the Lord, but there was no instinctive quickening of the heart or his senses to be ready and welcome Him. As night follows day, that will surely happen if you do that. It will, because carnality brings with it the overpowering inertia of this world. Small sin, it's addicting, but worse yet, it leads to greater sin. Like drugs that have to be taken in greater and greater quantities, doses, to have effect. So does small sin lead to larger sins, sins that entrap and destroy. There is no clearer example of that than Lot's journey. The consequences kept going from bad to worse. Toward the end, he thought nothing of marrying a pagan woman. giving his daughters to crazy sodomites and then treating them like chattels to be traded off. Is it any wonder that at the very end of all of this, his own daughters suborned Lot into incest with him? That's what it says. The firstborn said to the younger, "Our father is old. There is not a man on earth to come to us after the manner of the earth. Come, let us make our father drink wine. Let us lie with him, that we may preserve our family through our father." Is there anything lower a believing father can fall to? Is there? Yes, there is. How about living the rest of your life in shame and in fear? How about thinking death thoughts every day for the rest of your life? Genesis 19 from verse 30. Lot went up from Zoar, stayed in the mountains, and he and his two daughters with him, for he was afraid to stay in Zoar. And, get this, he stayed in a cave, he and his two daughters. And both daughters were with child. Firstborn bore a son, called him Moab. The younger also bore a son, called him Ben-Ami. Friends, how about grandchildren? Grandchildren who want to make you want to take your own life every day. Do you know what Moab means? Literally, from father. That's what it means. I guess daughter wanted father never to forget, didn't she? Lot sowed, allowed little sins to become his life, and he reaped the consequences in spades. He spent his remaining days physically and spiritually entombed in a cave. What is that if not a degenerated, death-like existence? Every day sinking into deeper and deeper depression and corruption. If you're here today, yet you're dallying with sin, I hope you've been listening very carefully. As sure as day follows night, sin will be punished. Judgment awaits those who have not turned from sin and fled to the safety of the cross. Maybe like Lot, you've been prominent, an influencer. You too have bartered away your faith. If somehow Lot's shoes fits, if you are like Lot, you're conflicted, trying desperately to function like him, but consider this. Lot was barely saved. What about you? I hope you're close enough to someone who can warn you, is determined to warn you. Just like Lot's wife and his two daughters were warned. And if, like those two sons-in-law of his did, who laughed at his warnings, I warn you in the name of God, both severe consequences and judgments await you, just like it did them. Is there hope? I do not know. None of the Sodomites were saved. But Lot was, and perhaps that is hope enough. He was a miserable excuse of a man, a wreck, and yet he was saved. And maybe wagering with your life is your thing, I don't know. Just remember, he was saved as through fire. That's what you're looking to do. I'd like you to turn on a brighter note. Before we close, I'd like you to turn to one of the most moving scenes in all of the Bible. Verses 27 to 29. What a profoundly stirring and dramatic moment this was. The first thing Abraham does, as soon as he gets up that morning, is to go where he and the Lord stood barely a dozen hours before. A bit further off from his place, but he goes there and looks down at Sodom, towards Sodom and the central valley of Siddim. We're not told what he expected to find, but the text clearly tells us what he did find. Where he had been almost contentious before, pleading, negotiating passionately, now he gazes silently, scanning the fertile, teeming fields that Lot had so coveted. Then smoke, overwhelming sulfuric fumes now filled the air. The valley that was once so loved by Lot was now one vast furnace. Not a trace of the cities of the plain remained. I want to go back to Genesis 18, verse 25. These were Lot's thoughts. Well, he actually said them out loud the day before to God. He said, "Far be it from you to do such a thing, to slay the righteous with the wicked, so that the righteous and the wicked are treated alike. Far be it from you, shall not the judge of all the earth deal justly," he said. Doubtless, this challenging words, his own challenging words the day before, are on Abraham's heart. And in those few moments, Abraham remembers his own words. "Far be it from you to do such a thing." He had challenged God. "Far be it from you, shall not the judge of all the earth deal justly." And now, understanding God's holiness, understanding God's omnipotence, understanding his compassion like he had never before, now, most importantly, he understands that simultaneously, God is a just and righteous God too, at the same time. And understanding that, Abraham, again without uttering a word, in his heart of hearts, answers his own challenge as he poignantly turns away. Let's pray. Tutor us, teach us closely, Father. For like Lot, we are all easily swayed and bent on wiggling away from your grasp. Like Lot, our hearts so easily turn to the lures of this world, to creature comforts, to great jobs, to big cars, to trophy homes, to fame and fortune, to glitzy lives. Like Lot, we are all too quickly given to cut corners, to compromise. Tutor us, teach us closely, to come and look at our Sodom. Teach us your ways, like you taught Abraham. Like us, he wasn't perfect, his understanding flawed, his obedience spotty. And yet his imperfections comfort us, his steadfast faith inspires us. Like you did Abraham, Father, teach us all to stay the course. Through all the twists and turns of life, through all the days you've given us to live, keep us from the slippery slopes. Keep us from wiggling away. Keep us from straying into dead-end roads. Keep us from the Sodoms that line our path. That is our prayer, and we pray it in the Lord Jesus' name. Now to the King eternal, holy, immortal, invisible, the only God, be honor and glory forever and ever. Amen. Thank you.